I'm Ricky Bergner. I'm the Director for University Partnerships and Civic Engagement here on campus. I am on campus. We have what's called an AB 963 coordinator. We are mandated by the state of California to make sure that we are offering voter education resources to our campus and particularly to the students. So there's a poster back there if you have not registered, or I invite you to also reconfirm your registration. Click on that link and that will put us into the ballot bowl competition. Right now the competition has been going on for 4 weeks. It's conducted by the state of California Secretary of State's office. And for the first time in 4 years, we are #1 of all the other CSU campuses. So the reason we say let's beat Fullerton is because my boss, he is an alum of Fullerton, and so we just like doing it because unfortunately they won last 2 years ago. So we want to make sure that that's top of mind for us. So welcome to today's Constitution Day talk. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for inviting me to welcome all of you, and I give it back to you.
All right, thank you. So every single year we have a Constitution Day talk around September 17th. If it falls on a weekend, we can have it on a Friday or a Monday. The federal government has passed a law that says that we have to have an event every single year for any institution that's receiving federal funding. So this is our annual observance of Constitution Day. I hope that you come back next year and we have an event every single year on September 17th if it's during the week, so look for us. Today what I want to talk about a little bit is about the Constitution, big money, and the big election that's coming up forward, and a little bit of background about the Constitution. In order to do that, I'll first talk a little bit about just an overview. I want to explain how I go about studying the Constitution in terms of its interpretation. I then want to talk about Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. It's a major case that was determined by the Supreme Court. And then I want to talk about some of the implications as it's played out in our current election, in our current election cycle. So let's begin a little bit with an overview to the Constitution. Specifically, the Constitution is read as the Constitution's text that is very famous with "We the People," and then it includes the amendments to the Constitution that follow the Constitution. The original Bill of Rights you might conceive of as kind of a list of what the government can't do. Remember, the revolutionaries were revolting against King George and the British system of monarchy, and so they were very skeptical of the government controlling these individual rights that people would have. So if you think about the list of the Bill of Rights, it's kind of like a prohibition on what the government can do, right? The government can't take away your freedom to speak. It can't take away your freedom to assemble. It can't take away your right to vote. It can't take away your right to own guns. It can't take away your right to be held by a jury of your peers. You can't just be tried by a monarch that says off with your head. It has to be from your peers. All of these things are kind of enshrined in the Bill of Rights as checks that were a reaction to that British system. Now we know that the Bill of Rights is not guaranteed, right, in terms of all the rights. We know that there are limitations on all of these things that occur when they come into conflict with each other. We've had to navigate it. You know, you have a right to public safety. Does that mean that you own the right to have a bazooka? No, you don't, right? And so we've navigated those particular freedoms over the course of our constitutional history. So that's the kind of dynamic that plays out in terms of an election. That's the kind of subject matter that I want to talk about today. But first, let's talk about a little overview about what the Constitution means. Does the Constitution mean anything? The answer to that is super complicated because, in a sense, from my perspective as a rhetorical scholar, when I study rhetoric, I study interpretations. Rhetorical studies, therefore, suggest that the answer is really complicated about whether the Constitution means anything. Rhetoric is grounded in this ancient study from Aristotle in the faculty of discerning in any given case the available means of persuasion. But it also involves the study over the contests over meaning, how people negotiate meaning, how people are persuaded to believe that things mean what they mean, how we are interpreting it together collectively, how we argue what the meaning should be, how we contest factually if the Constitution says what we think that it says. And since humans interpret the constitutional text in different ways, the Constitution doesn't mean one specific thing, right? We might think that it means one thing, but we also know that there are exceptions to it. Why? Because we've interpreted it as such. We are persuaded to believe in certain meanings. We adopt certain meanings at the expense of other meanings. And so this Constitution is contingent. What the Constitution meant 50, 100, 200 years ago is changing to the way that we interpret it today, based on different circumstances and different cases. Roe v. Wade was precedent before. Roe v. Wade is no longer precedent. That's a popular current example. So what it meant before that is different now because of a case that was argued and having justices believe and buy into one interpretation over another. So this idea that the Constitution means any one thing is going to be something that I want to kind of get out of our vocabulary and more toward a rhetorical understanding that it's more dynamic, it's argumentative, it's humanly negotiated. We have to adopt and circumscribe certain beliefs about what the meaning should be. So what are the tools that we have in order to get there? One of the tools is this philosopher by the name of Philip Bobbitt. And he offered 6 different modalities for interpreting the Constitution's text. He said if you take a look at the meaning of the language in the Bill of Rights, in any particular constitutional mandate, there are one of 6 different ways that you can interpret it and overlapping possibilities to begin with. So these 6 might overlap into a very wide number of interpretations depending on what perspective you have for giving meaning to those words. So for example, the textual interpretation begins with what does the text actually say, right? So in this strict meaning, when the Constitution says in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, if you look at the words in the text from this interpretation, it would mean that universities could tell you to just be quiet and not be able to say anything, right? President Connolly could say, students show up in their cars, silence their mouths, don't say anything to anybody, anytime, anywhere, right? And she's perfectly within her constitutional rights to do that, right? Because it says, Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say university presidents shall make no law, right? Now, of course, we haven't interpreted it that way, right? But if we take a look at it from a strict textualist perspective, we can have the actual words. We interpret Congress to mean any representative of the state, right? We've broadly interpreted that over time to say, you know what, we're a public place. Presidents of universities should not be able to do that. So of course, we're not going to allow that to happen in terms of our American freedom. It didn't mean just Congress. Congress is not the literal word. Or if we're talking about digital communication, they could say, look, you don't have any right to freedom of speech on the internet. There's nothing that says that the internet is a speech, right? If you took a speech course and you learned how to create a website, you might be pretty upset with that, right? Because speech means oral communication, right? It means talking, it means delivering speeches. So when it says you have that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, then maybe they could make any law abridging your freedoms on the internet. That's not speech, that's digital, right? If you look up the word speech in the dictionary, it's not going to mean digital, right? So the textual interpretation takes a look at what these words mean in their textual sense. Historical modality has to do with the meaning of the words that as they appeared when they were originally adopted, right? So when the framers were getting together and they were having arguments about the First Amendment, what did they mean by the First Amendment when they passed it? What were they debating about? Were they debating about information generally? Were they debating about democratic participation? If so, we might argue and extrapolate that the framers had intended for us to include universities as a place of free speech, or not, right? We might argue from the perspective of the framers to say that, yeah, a lot of our democratic deliberations might occur online, and because they were primarily concerned with democratic deliberation at the time, that should be included in what we mean by freedom of speech, right? And so we can extrapolate different historical meanings based on that kind of paradigm, right? The third one has to do with structural interpretations. Structural interpretations have to do when different amendments might conflict with each other, right? So in the First Amendment, we have the freedom to assemble, but we also have the right to vote, right? And so if we have the right to vote, if you are assembling in a way that blocks people's access to a voting booth, you can't do that, right? You have to be within a certain distance away. You also have a right to be safe and secure in your possessions. So if you're assembling in a way that prevents firefighters from getting to the fire hydrant to put a fire out, then we're not going to say that that's your freedom of assembly, right? We've negotiated and defined it in a different way, given the way that we have to negotiate these competing rights, right, in a given case. So that's the third area. The fourth area is the prudential reasoning. It says that we need to interpret the Constitution for things to work, right? The most workable solution. In the ideal sense, we might have some commitment to a value, but we have to interpret it in order to work. The most famous example of this is when the court ruled in favor of a high school principal to have the ability to interpret things in live events really, really fast. In this case, the students upheld a banner that said "Bong hits for Jesus." It's a really famous case. And when they unfurled this 15-foot banner that said "Bong hits for Jesus," the principal in that moment had to make a determination: was this pro-drug speech encouraging students to use drugs, or was it just a joke and meaningless and nonsense? And in that moment, the Supreme Court said that it's up to the principal to kind of determine that because of the speed at which it has to happen, right? She doesn't know in that moment for sure which way it's going to go or not. And so pragmatically, prudentially, we're going to allow her to interpret the freedom of speech to say, as long as it's a reasonable interpretation, giving deference to the principal to determine, we're going to allow the principal to have that kind of thing. Because if we have to defer to a principal in the other direction and the principal can never intervene, then nobody will probably want to be a principal, right? Why would anyone want to be a principal of a school if taking a banner can cause you to lose your house, right? Nobody's going to take that risk and do that. So the Supreme Court will say, well, pragmatically then, in order for us to have good principals and good administrators, people who are willing to do that job, we have to give them some sort of deference in those kinds of difficult decision-making powers, right? So there's a prudential interpretation. The fifth modality is a doctrinal or a precedential kind of modality. This interpretation is based on the prior rulings of the court. It's based on this notion of stare decisis, let the decision stand. It's this idea that we should know what the rules generally are, and the rules are generally determined by the precedents that we've established. So if we've defined it in one case, and then we define it completely different in another case, nobody's going to know what rules to follow, right? It's going to be chaotic. We're never going to know what the decision actually is. And so the Supreme Court has tried to adopt the stare decisis standard, the precedent arguing from previous Supreme Court rulings that have interpreted it, to new cases that come before it. And then the last interpretation for a modality is the ethical one. It says, it might be nice that the framers might have interpreted a particular way. It might be nice that the textual might be that way, but we're the ones who've got to live with it, right? We're the ones living with it right now. So we need to make the words of the amendment mean what work for us, right? What values are in the First Amendment that we can extrapolate from that value of free speech, that we have the right to our own self-esteem needs, our own artistic expression, right? Do we really want to silence the artists of our current era? Do we want to interpret the First Amendment to allow that or not? The ethical appeals to certain values and interprets the words of the Constitution to be consistent with those values. Okay, that's all complicated, right? It's even more complicated when you put them in contest with each other, right? Because now you're talking about, well, should we interpret it from the ethical perspective, or should we interpret it from the historical perspective? Should we privilege a textual interpretation, or should we privilege a precedent, right? Is the precedent more important than the history if we think that that precedent is bad precedent? If we think that it's bad precedent, then we overrule precedent, right? And if we overrule precedent, then what does that say for the rule of law going forward when we don't know what the Constitution is going to mean because we have different historical interpretations that arise, right? The bottom line that we're left with in all of this is that it's an ongoing rhetorical process. We can privilege and be drawn toward one or more of these competing interpretations in any given case, and this is why we have to decide. If rhetoric is concerned with this study of human affairs, this idea that we need to navigate this democratic life together, then it's also about us navigating what the Constitution means in terms of that democratic life. Does that make sense? Cool. Another way of viewing this, the idea of interpretation, is this idea of credibility, right? Some people examine Aristotle's a notion of ethos that involves sagacity, character, and goodwill. And when we're taking a look at the Supreme Court as the prime body that interprets the Constitution, this kind of view has come into existence in terms of, do we really interpret it based on these 6 modalities of constitutional interpretation? Or are there other factors? Are there ill will behind the Supreme Court members, right? Are we interpreting it on the basis of money, right? So we take a look at, should we have ethics standards for our Supreme Court? Should we have ethical practices, right? Most recently, Justice Roberts has come into question. Justice Thomas has come into question. Justice Alito has come into question, right? Not too long ago, Justice Sotomayor was called into question with her wise Latina remarks. And so attacking the credibility, the character, the wisdom that one might have as an arbitrator to interpret the Constitution. Are these the people then that we want to interpret the Constitution for us? Are they representative of that? And does that then impact the legitimacy of how we view what the Constitution is, right? And so from a rhetorical perspective, it's always going to be bound up into this question of the business of isness, as I like to call it. Another way of framing this is whether or not there's this idea of hegemony or concordance, right? The hegemonic paradigm is one that takes a look at the Supreme Court justices and it points to the corruption influences, right? It says that if you have a lot of powerful interests that are involved, then that's going to influence the Constitution to be interpreted in a particular way, right? If I'm a billionaire and I want the Constitution to be interpreted in a particular way, I can just pay for Justice Thomas's luxury vacations and his flights that he's taken, and therefore sway him to be able to interpret the Constitution based on one of those 6 modalities that I just outlined, to be able to rule in my favor because I'm paying for those ill motivations, right? There's a power play involved then, right? I'm paying for that kind of power by having the Supreme Court be the arbitrator in the favorable way that I want, right? This is all the arguments about the Supreme Court being a body of special interest. That's what the hegemonic paradigm kind of operates under the assumption of, that if you pay the Supreme Court enough through vacations and all these other things that are being covered up, then you're going to be paying for the influence. It argues that even if the Supreme Court disagrees with power on occasion, the only reason that it's doing that is to maintain its own power and to add to its own credibility just enough to maintain the institution's legitimacy to achieve its powerful interests, okay? So that's the hegemonic paradigm. The one that comes up into odds with the hegemonic paradigm is this paradigm for concordance, right? Concordance paradigm rests on the assumption that the court is a reflection of a shared ideology, right? It says that justices, that of course the justices are going to be ruling in these special interests. They've always believed the same things as these special interests, right? So if they believe that Roe v. Wade is not good precedent in the Constitution, and they believe that before they're nominated, and they have a historical record of not believing that, when they get on the court and then they're backed by powerful interests that are anti-abortion, of course they're going to be anti-abortion. They've been anti-abortion their whole life. They share ideologies, right? It's not a surprise. They're not being paid off. They're in agreement, right? So this is the concordance view. So it's not that Justice Thomas would necessarily be corrupted by a billionaire influence. It's just that the billionaire and Justice Thomas share an ideology. And the billionaire happens to have a lot of money. And they're good friends, just like you might have friends that also have more money than you or less money than you. And you might also share the same kind of ideas, right? The concordance view would also say that it points to the idea that the Supreme Court is an authentic one, right? The concordance paradigm would say that the most common decision of the Supreme Court is a unanimous one. If it was so corrupt to this hegemonic influence, then why is it that they agree most of the time? Most of their decisions are 9-0s, right? How do you explain when two people that are appointed by the Republican presidents disagree with each other in a Supreme Court case? You would expect that their ideologies and their power would align, right? How do you explain in Bush v. Gore, probably the most contentious Supreme Court case in our history, decided the outcome of a presidential election? How do you explain the fact that George H.W. Bush's appointee was Souter, who ruled against Bush in Bush v. Gore? How do you explain that? If it was really about power, what's more powerful than voting against your president, right? And so the concordance view would point to these kinds of things as an interpretive document, right? But these are the powerful ways that people come to interpret the Constitution. So this all being said, this is why constitutional argumentation is complicated, right? It's very, very complicated because at the same time that we have these 6 modalities going on in any given Constitution text, we also have divergent paradigms that the public operates under. Many members of the public view it from a hegemonic paradigm. Many members of the public view it from a concordance paradigm. Many members of the public want to interpret it historically. Others want to interpret it textually. Others want to interpret it ethically. Others want to do a combination of all, right? And so it becomes super complicated to be able to determine. One of the things that emerges from this kind of perspective is this idea of the public sphere versus the technical sphere. And there's more spheres, but these are the 2 ones that I want to talk about today. The public sphere is one in which we all engage in this construct of democratic thought together. We engage in these practices to figure out what the Constitution means, but we do that on a range of issues, from global warming. What are our thoughts about the environment? What are our thoughts about the state of human health and resources? What are the state of national security in terms of our military operations overseas? All of these things that we want to debate in a democratic population are essential to our democracy functioning, right? And on the other hand, we have a shrinking public sphere in contrast to what is termed the technical sphere. This is by the work of Professor Goodnight over at USC, right? The technical sphere is one where experts get increasingly tons of information and knowledge about these factors, information that the public sometimes doesn't even have access to, but also information that the public just generally doesn't think about and yet are still making decisions about, right? So for example, 2/3 of the American public still, to this day, cannot name a single Supreme Court justice, right? Only 1% of the American public can name all 9 Supreme Court justices. I won't call out anyone in this room, but if you can't name all 9 Supreme Court justices, you're not alone. But as a constitutional expert, more in the technical sphere than the public sphere, but I also am in the public sphere, kind of trying to bridge that with talks like I'm giving today, I find it incredibly astounding, totally astounding, that 1% can name all 9 Supreme Court justices, Why? Because the Supreme Court justices are there longer, right? The overwhelming majority of the American population can name who the President of the United States is, but they can't name the 9 people that can overrule the President, right? They can't name the 9 people that can overrule Congress. And they're there the longest. They're not secretive. You can attend an oral argument. You can go watch it happening, the proceeding in Washington, D.C. They're there all the time, right? I mean, we don't get more than 1 or 2 every 5 or 6 years or so, right? And yet we don't know who they are, okay? The technical sphere then is one where experts are the ones that are studying this. So for me, studying constitutional texts, reading Supreme Court cases, thousands and thousands of pages of them every single year, right? I get a clear kind of picture of just how dynamic this constitutional thing works, right? But it's enormously complicated where ordinary citizens are trying to figure out even what to do. So let alone the amount of expertise that it takes for me to understand what's going on in the Supreme Court. There's a number of areas for me to try to figure out what our foreign policy should be toward Azerbaijan. I don't know, right? I'm not reading about Azerbaijan all the time. Many of you may not even know that it's a country, right? And yet we need to figure out what our foreign policy is going to be about all of these different countries in the world, in addition to all the host of other complicated things, right? And so we have this kind of emerging problem in our information age where so much of this information is available and it's becoming more and more in the hands of experts, and it's kind of shrinking into that public sphere where it's becoming harder and harder to follow that information as a public. So I thank you for being here today because that's part of my quest here. All right, so let's talk about Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission in terms of our own election, okay? Citizens United was a landmark case dealing with campaign finance regulations. I could give a series of lectures on Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. I have. So I'm just going to briefly give a synopsis about it. It's the first case that Justice Elena Kagan ever argued in front of the Supreme Court when she was Solicitor General. It's the first case that Justice Sotomayor ever heard on the Supreme Court, and it's one of the most controversial in our country's history, if at the very least, the most influential in the way that modern elections are run in terms of the money that is involved, okay? Citizens United begins, and I begin the story of Citizens United. We can begin back with McCain-Feingold Act and all kinds of other reform, but I kind of begin the impetus for the case with Michael Moore. Michael Moore is a famous documentary filmmaker. He made the film Fahrenheit 9/11 amongst other movies. Fahrenheit 9/11 was released within a banned amount of days according to campaign finance law before an election, okay? So Fahrenheit 9/11 was released in this window that arguably should not have been released if it was considered electioneering communication, okay? Citizens United, a conservative group, was in opposition to this film because it characterized President George W. Bush in a negative light for, amongst other things, getting us involved in Iraq when there wasn't any weapons of mass destruction that were found, and in terms of the election with Bush v. Gore, and cast him in a negative light. Citizens United was really upset about this, said that because it cast him in such a negative light, and it was so close to an election, that should not have been allowed to air within that window. It violated the federal election laws, okay? The Federal Elections Commission found that it wasn't really a violation at all. It allowed the film to go unpunished. It said that it wasn't electioneering communication. Specifically, it wasn't electioneering communication because it had to do with a currently seated president, and after all, people have the right to be critical of their public officials, so this film was critical of the President George W. Bush and not the candidate President George W. Bush, okay? So Citizens United then was really upset about this decision. They said, okay, so that's the rules we're going to play by, that we can create films that are critical of active politicians, and it's not going to be considered electioneering communication. So then Citizens United created a film a couple years later called Hillary the Movie, okay? And their film was very critical of Hillary Clinton. They argued that it was the senator of the state of New York that was under attack, an actively seated politician that they were critical of. And just like in the Michael Moore case, it couldn't be therefore considered to be electioneering communication. They put it through in demand, so that it was, or on demand network, so it was private to private communication. It wasn't considered public, so it couldn't be electioneering communication. It was really a film that was critical of an active politician, okay? The Hillary Clinton campaign begged to differ. They filed a complaint to the Federal Elections Commission saying that it violated the federal campaign laws, and the Federal Elections Commission ruled against Citizens United in the case. They said that the film was electioneering communication, that it violated the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, and therefore that was subject to fines and censorship, okay? Citizens United was pretty upset about this, right? Because they said, why is it good for Michael Moore and not good for us? He can create a documentary and we can't create a documentary. This doesn't seem right. So they then filed suit in federal court saying that their First Amendment right was violated, that they had the right to spend the money that they wanted in free association with other people to be able to make a film that's critical about a candidate and a current politician, okay? Case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 opinion, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Citizens United. They reasoned that there were a number of complicated problems with the Federal Elections Commission treatment of the case. Amongst those included, number one, that banning a documentary film would be parallel to banning a book that would be critical of it, right? A documentary film and a book are not far off. So banning a documentary says that you also, on what basis would you then not ban books? They said that it was freedom of press, because most of our press entities were also corporations, just like Citizens United was a corporation, that freedom of press would be censored. If Citizens United were not allowed to print their message that was critical of Hillary the Movie, then what about the New York Times Corporation or the Fox News Corporation or any other editorialist that would be printing their material, right? So it was a freedom of press issue. They argued that it was not within the founders' interpretation. The majority cited doctrine about the anti-slavery Quaker corporations that expressed themselves on political views at the time, and therefore corporations should also be able to express their political views. They argued for an ethical interpretation, that corporations are part of our marketplace, and if citizens are going to make an informed decision about the way that their leaders would function, then they should have a voice in the election, right? That if you are an oil company and the oil company employs thousands of employees and is a vital part of our economic infrastructure, to muzzle an effect that a candidate might have on the oil corporation would amount to an ill-informed democratic process that people wouldn't be able to decide the state of economic power or loss as a factor in their economic decision making, right? And so all of these things kind of converged in the Citizens United case. The result was that both corporations and unions could gather together in freedom of assembly, because they were private individuals, that just like you can get together and you can pool your money to buy a poster. Maybe you can't afford a poster individually, but if you pool your money with 4 or 5 other people and you buy a poster and a marker and you write a message that the 4 or 5 of you agree with and you hold it on a street corner, just as you can do that today, Citizens United should be able to do that with a movie. New York Times should be able to do it with their editorial columns, that any movie makers, any type of advertisers should be able to do that with their money as well, okay? So that set the precedent, changed changed the entire dynamic of the way that our elections kind of work. So how does that impact our current elections? You'll see from this diagram that we are on pace outspending any other prior election cycles. Our current election cycle is set to spend over $1 billion in political types of advertisements, from the presidency down to the local kind of races, right? So we have this whole change in the way that it worked. In 2008, it was 100 million, and you can see the kind of trend generally moving up from election to election, right? And these are in the House races. There's at least two pots of money here that are really important to understand. Okay, there's at least two pots of money that every politician is concerned with. Pot one has to do with direct contributions, okay? Those are the ones that if I'm a political candidate and you donate directly to my campaign, those are the ones that are still regulated by the Federal Elections Commission, okay? All those rules that were in effect before the Citizens United are still in effect in a way, right? There's some modifications to that. You can't censor corporate money from spending on their own because of Citizens United. So the limits and the caps are still there for direct contributions. So if you want to give me money as a politician, then that amount of money will be still able to be regulated by the Federal Elections Commission. That money I have complete control over pretty much when you donate it. There's other regulations. I don't want to say complete, but I have a lot more autonomy on how that's spent, okay? The other pot of money that's available to a politician is one where a collection of people can gather their resources and advocate on their own on my behalf, okay? So, you get together with 4 of your other billionaire friends and you make $100 million political advertisement and you put it out there for me. I don't know anything about it. It's still technically illegal for me to tell you what movie to produce. It's still technically illegal for me to communicate with you, hey, I need you to put this message out, right? That line, though, is somewhat irrelevant, right? Because all a politician needs to say in some sort of press release is, well, if I had the money, I would make this kind of movie, wink, wink, and then they can go ahead and do that on their own, right? So it is kind of an indirect way of directing it, but they can't go to them directly and say, make this movie. If that communication is ever documented or found out, that would be in violation of the federal campaign laws, okay? But it's kind of created this slippery slope. That's why I say there's two pots of money that are available. So when we're reading about money in elections, know that these two pots exist. There's money that's directly given to a candidate, and then there's money that is raised by what are called super PACs. Those are the corporations that have arisen after Citizens United. Super PACs are the corporations that are the assembly of individuals that raise that money for a particular idea or cause in an election. Good? All right. So given those two pots, the two pots in our current presidential election, as you can see, the latest data available through the beginning of August showed that Harris, Trump, and their directly allied groups with bank accounts totaling a combined of around $700 million, according to the campaign finance trackers at Open Secrets, including more than $370 million raised directly by the two campaign operations. Outside super PACs backing one of the candidates also reported another 200 million or so in the bank, okay? So you can see that that the way that Citizens United then changed the election is that $370 million is the stuff that's given directly to me as a candidate. That's what's currently raised by the candidates that I would have control over. But that's roughly half of the available money, right? Because you have $700 million. Oh no, the 700, so it's roughly half the amount of money. You have about $330 million of the 700 million that is raised by your super PACs. That make sense? So you've got an enormous amount of money that changes the kind of entire landscape of this. Now I want to talk about some of the potential dangers of this that we've discovered in the wake of the Citizens United. The first danger is that there was this argument that if you allow corporations to spend as much money in an election, that it would open us up to foreign influence, that foreign corporations, therefore, would be able to spend money in our elections, like British Petroleum, okay? The Citizens United decision specifically said that foreign corporations could still be regulated, okay? This became a big contentious issue because during the State of the Union address, in a real famous moment, President Obama said that the Citizens United decision opened it up to the influence of foreign corporations. And you see Justice Alito, and the Supreme Court justices were supposed to be fairly stoic, not showing any emotion during the State of the Union address. And you see Justice Alito shake his head and say, that's not true, okay? And it was a big moment in American history when you had a Supreme Court justice saying that's not true to a president of the United States during a State of the Union address, and it was made a very big deal. My reading as a scholar is that both were kind of right? Both were kind of right. Justice Alito was right from that textual perspective, right? That textual perspective of the Constitution, that interpretation that I offered, because Citizens United, specifically that decision, said that foreign corporations did not have the freedom to spend unlimited amounts of money. So the British Petroleum Corporation, for example, can't just spend all of its money on backing a particular candidate because that would be in violation of our campaign laws. So Justice Alito was right when he said that foreign corporations can't just spend as much as they want. My reading of what President Obama has said from that and other remarks wasn't that necessarily foreign corporations in the textual sense would have the influence, but that it would open up the influence to other interests that are invested in American corporations, right? That you would have foreign investors investing their money in American corporations and showing their influence on those corporations in terms of the election. This is what we talk about with election interference, right? If you read in the LA Times today, I think it's on like A10 or something. I know, I'm old school. I still get a newspaper delivered to my house in the morning, and I read it. I try to at least scan most of it in the morning as I'm eating breakfast. But in the newspaper today, there's an article about the investigations of an American corporation based in Tennessee. I think it's like RT or TR or some two-letter abbreviation that had somewhere in the range of $10 million of money that was invested in the corporation from Russian influence to then put in digital kind of markers on different kind of internet sites, and they're under the investigation to figure out if that's a way that foreign entities are influencing our American corporations to spend resources on these elections. And in no short part, the article was talking about the Russian interest in polarizing Americans even more politically so that it could decrease the likelihood of aid to Ukraine and therefore help their efforts of invading Ukraine by creating more dissension in amongst the American public. And the more the American public disagrees with each other, the less likely they're able to agree on Ukraine and other issues, and therefore it would help their war efforts in terms of meddling in our elections. Okay, that's what the newspaper article was kind of talking about. Similarly, there's been a recent accusation that I think it was a New York-based politician, that she was in local governance and signing off on certain things that certain public officials believe were in Chinese interests. and that her husband owned an American corporation and their holding, and the Chinese government was investing significantly in her husband's corporation while she was making decisions in public office, right? And so you've got this American corporation that's being kind of used in these kind of ways to open up foreign influence. And that's been kind of one of the dangers that we've had to look out for, even more so in the wake of Citizens United. A second implication for the Citizens United decision is that there's a certain threshold for viability. It should be noted that just because you raise more money with your super PACs, just because you raise more money in an election doesn't mean you're going to win, okay? It doesn't mean you're going to win. You could have way more money than the next person and still lose an election. In fact, that's happened historically, okay? President Obama raised less money in his first election, I believe, and he won that election, right? You can raise less, but what it does now is that there's a certain threshold where you need to raise in order to be viable. If you listen to the remarks of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. when he was withdrawing from the race, he was kind of speaking to that recently, that it's very hard because unless you raise a certain amount of money, you're not going to have the attorneys to stem off all the legal actions. You're not going to have enough money to be able to carry the political ads that you need. So you need a certain degree of financial viability in this current kind of electionscape in order to be a viable candidate. So that means that if you're a candidate that's not willing to allow super PAC money to be in, if you're a candidate that might even speak against a super PAC to say, stop doing that, I don't support that, you're not likely to win an election anymore because you need that kind of help, right? So it's kind of changed the way that politicians have needed to work in terms of their own viability. Now, it used to be related to number 3. The third one is that candidates can stay in a race longer with little support. They can do so now with a wealthy backer. It used to be prior to Citizens United that if you raised a lot of money, that would help you stay in a race. But because the financial contributions were limited to a certain level of donation, you had to get more people to donate, right? So the more people that would donate to your cause, the more likely you were to stay into a race. Advocates of that system would say that that's a good thing because it means you have more support, right? So if you get 10,000 people to contribute early on in the campaign and you use all that money to be in the next big political event, once you use that money, you're gone. So you better raise more support from another 10,000 or more to be able to get more money, another 10,000 to get more money. You have 30,000 backers and you need more and more and more momentum to keep yourself in a race, right? So arguably, the defenders of that system would say that that's a more democratic way of doing it because you would have those limitations and more people would have to actually donate to those races. After Citizens United, a remarkable thing happened. When the Republican primary came into existence, I don't know if you remember or even were cognizant of politics at all at the time, but it was the primary when Mitt Romney ended up winning, right? When Mitt Romney ended up winning, that primary was unlike any other primary that we had seen prior to that with the Republican history. At one point, it would be that you would have to gain momentum through the primary process in order to remain a candidate. But a remarkable thing happened in that election. What ended up happening was Newt Gingrich had one really big donor, one really, really big backer, and it could keep him in the primary race the entire time. Mitt Romney was a pretty difficult person to attack at the time. He did wonderful humanitarian things. Those kinds of things I think are indisputable. Newt Gingrich would fire off his attacks at every other opponent, Rubio, etc., right? Just one after another after another. Imagine like Royal Rumble style WWE, and you got one person picking off a candidate at a time. And he would just put as many attacks at other people as possible. He didn't even care necessarily about defending his own record. in those debates. It was all about attacking the other candidates, making them peel off. He knew he could stay in the race because he had the wealthy backer, and then therefore he could hopefully be the last person standing, okay? So eventually every candidate went away, but the thing was, his attacks didn't work against Mitt Romney, okay? His attacks didn't work against Mitt Romney, and then Mitt Romney became the presidential candidate, right? That process has kind of happened continually in our primaries to this day. If you think about Trump's election, in the last election, President Trump was the Newt Gingrich kind of placeholder, right? Donald Trump could stay in that primary. He was very low as of Iowa. He was like at 12% or something really low in terms of his support, but he had the wealthy backing, which meant that he could levy his attacks against one candidate after another, but this time it stuck to all of them and he was the last person standing, right? And then he became the presidential candidate because he was able to stay in. He didn't, if it was the traditional election cycle, I would say that he may not have been able to stay in the race for as long as he was in order to win, right? Because at the beginning, he would have ran out of money. He wouldn't have had the amount of supporters to stay in the race as long as he could. This thing has occurred all throughout, and now we're seeing the dynamic where President Biden drops out of the race and candidate Harris is not, Vice President Harris is not even elected in the normal primary process, right? She eventually was, she gained the primary, but she didn't go through the kind of primary debates like we would traditionally think about them going through, right? And so our whole elections landscape has kind of changed as a result. And then the last real kind of danger here is that a lot of the donors have become untrackable until after an election, right? These super PACs, what they've been able to do is corporations can give to other corporations in an election, right? So if I set up a corporation and another corporation and another corporation and another corporation and another corporation, and this corporation gives to this corporation, who gives to this corporation, who gives to this corporation, who gives to this corporation, if I do it in that kind of way, one of the things that Citizens United required was that you are disclosing where the contributions come from, right? Even if you are a corporation. There was a mandatory disclosure requirement, okay? The trick of it, though, is that the disclosure has to happen within a certain number of days. So if the disclosure happens within 30 days, because there's multiple corporations that are involved in giving and giving and giving, I find out who donated it within this 30-day window, and it's this corporation. Okay, so now I want to find out who gave it to this corporation. It's another 30-day window. I need to find out who gave it to this corporation, another 30-day window. This corporation, you get the point, right? So then we don't often find out where the original sources of the contributions came from until after the election is finished, right? So that's kind of changed the way that our trackability, our accountability to figure out as citizens where the money kind of comes from. All right, so let's go back to constitutional interpretation. What this means is that constitutional interpretation is an enormously complicated thing, right? It's enormously complicated by not only the definitions that come about. In this case, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the right of people to peaceably assemble. In ruling and deciding that Citizens United speech is part of that protected speech, and that Citizens United is a peaceably assembled group that is speaking together to elect or defeat a candidate, and that's protected speech. By defining it that way, we've changed an enormous amount about what the Constitution might have meant before that, right? We are also in the position to maybe change what the Constitution means after that. This is the status of judicial dissent, right? For example, Justice Stevens took on the historical interpretation by arguing that corporations always answered to politicians, that even if they were able to advocate on issues like the anti-slavery Quaker Corporation, even though they were able to take on issues like that, they were never advocating for the election or defeat of a candidate, right? And so Justice Stevens said that that the corporations always answered to Congress. Congress issued the charter. Therefore, Congress, the corporation wasn't ever intended to have a voice of who their bosses would be, essentially Congress, right? So based on that historical interpretation, he didn't believe that corporations were included in the right of them to peaceably assemble and engage in speech. That's not what the framers meant by freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. So he interpreted the Constitution differently in that particular case. So what this demonstrates is that when it comes down to arguing the Constitution, I know a lot of you are argumentation students that are here. When it comes to arguing the Constitution, hopefully this gives you kind of more full kind of picture about how constitutional interpretation works. There are resources for argumentation. There are resources for interpreting the Constitution, and there are resources for arguing and persuading people about the Constitution, okay? If you're ever in a position of arguing in front of the Supreme Court, like some of our alumni have been at this university, if you're ever in a position of arguing in front of the Supreme Court, you probably don't want to try to persuade a justice who agrees with a historical interpretation by using an ethical argument, right? Argumentation is only persuasive if you speak the language of the justice and from their paradigms that they operate from, okay? So argumentation can be a persuasive exercise. It's something that we need to agree with. It's something that we need to come to contend with each other about. It's something that we need to learn the skills of being engaged with each other and hopefully toward a common purpose, because at the end of the day, democracy is all about shared power and making decisions together, because your vote is just as powerful as my vote. Doesn't matter how much I know or how much you know, all of our votes are the same, and we need to make these decisions together. And that's, I think, that's the main takeaway that I'd like to have from our Constitution Day celebration. So thank you for coming today. We'll end our conversation here for the camera, and then we'll engage in some question and answers afterwards. Thank you.